At the close of the interview with Fern Mallis, I read an excerpt from her book entitled Fashion Icons. It was an emotional moment for both of us, for me in particular, because the interview personified a rare humility and inner grace. I'm going to end by reading what you wrote, and this was, again, one of my favorite parts of your book. Fashion is truly a collaborative business, and to pull off a successful show takes a village, a very cool, chic village. During this time, I get to see firsthand from the front row what worked, what didn't work, who triumphed, who failed. But more importantly, I learned and watched how hard this industry works, the dedication and commitment that it takes to succeed, season in and out, over and over again. No one is an overnight success. There is a price to pay for fame and fortune, but the respect and admiration I have for these people sustain me and bring me joy. Fern Mallis, thank you very much. I want to start out with your childhood because I'm always interested in, particularly with women, the number that they are. You're the middle child.
Middle of 3 daughters.
That's what I thought. And you loved going to the garment district with your dad?
I did. My father was a salesman selling women's scarves. And both of my uncles worked in the garment district as well, selling textiles and sportswear. And I loved every chance I had to go to work with him.
And yet you were the one, your eldest sister is an architect?
Correct.
And your youngest is an artist?
She's an artist and a mom of 3 extraordinary children.
And some of them are here in New York, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, actually, all 3 daughters are here.
Wow.
And her 2 grandchildren.
That is amazing. And that is really the legacy of the Mallis family.
Yes, they'll carry it on.
That's wonderful. So when you were small, going with your dad, watching him sell scarves, was there one experience that kind of brought some enlightenment to you that this is something that I want to do?
No, it's hard to pin down one experience. I mean, it was years and years of going to work with him, meeting his buyers and the fashion directors of the stores that he worked with, and going to lunch with him and watching the women design the scarves behind the scenes, and just being there, being, soaking in the energy of the district at that time. It was a very vital district. I mean, everybody was working on the streets, and everybody was talking to each other, everybody knew each other. They were all called garmentos, which I say lovingly.
Yeah.
Now that's not such a good term, but they were terrific. Almost everybody in New York, if you scratch the surface, that's somebody who worked in the garment district.
And your mom was an artist as well.
Well, my mom was not an artist, but she had the most common sense and was probably the most creative person. We always called her Martha Stewart before there was a Martha Stewart. She could make anything out of anything. She'd find some broken down, toy on the street, and we'd come home at night and she wired it into a lamp. Where she'd find an old tomato crate and upholster it and make it a doll bed and a cradle. And, she would paint the house, the interiors constantly. We never knew when we came home from school what color the walls would be.
So the common theme really in your family of origin is a little bit of a creative bent.
Absolutely. There's a lot of creativity in the house. My parents loved the theater. My mom went to Broadway all the time. They took us as kids every chance they got to the theater. We had art school at the Brooklyn Museum. There were always art supplies in the house encouraging us to be creative.
And when you went to school in Brooklyn, again, were there any experiences that kind of introduced you to this world of fashion?
Nothing really in Brooklyn that did that so much. I mean, I used to go to King's Highway, which was the big shopping street. There were a few kids in school who really, I thought, dressed really well, but I have to say, when all was said and done, in high school I was voted best dressed in my school, and Madison High School was a big high school.
That was a big high school, and yet your entry or your foray to this fashion world really was when you were writing the guest editor for Mademoiselle. How did that come about? Was it a competition, or how did?
Mademoiselle had a guest editor program for many, many years, and in my era, and a little before me and a little after me, it was one of the most prestigious honors to get and to receive. And they set up a college board, which was their kind of focus group, a target group of college students all over the country. You would submit something, you'd see it in the magazine, you'd send in an application, And they would pretty much take anybody on the college board. And if you were on the board, you would get periodic letters from them and maybe a package with things to review and advertise a product and, surveys, and so that they would be able to say back to their advertisers, this is what college girls in America are using, this is the product they like, this one sucks, whatever. And then from that group, they had a secondary, once you were a college board member, if you wanted to go on to possibly win a guest editorship, it was a tough competition, and there were different categories of all the things the magazine had, from poetry and literature to photography, fashion, design, graphics, all the different elements. And you could submit any number of projects that they would suggest or of your own. And I was studying fine arts and graphic design, commercial art, and I submitted a package that would have been a direct mail piece.
Oh, wow.
To subscribe to the magazine. Something that folded out in many ways and was a lot of fun to do. And next thing I knew, I got a letter or a call, I don't remember exactly, from an editor at Mademoiselle saying that they were going to be in my area in Buffalo. And could I spend some time with them and meet them? And I thought that they did this all the time to everybody. I didn't realize that
you were a finalist.
That I was being a finalist, being interviewed. And so I spent a day on campus with this editor. And to date myself and tell you how long ago this was, then I got about a month later, a telegram that said, you've been selected to be the guest editor. And that was probably one of the most exciting pieces of mail I ever got in my life.
1969.
1969. And I followed in the footsteps of people like Betsy Johnson and Sylvia Plath and Nellie McGraw and all sorts of people. And I was the guest art editor. So I skipped my graduation at school to come to New York and be an editor for the month of June.
And then director at Gimbel's. I want to hear about that. That sounds kind of interesting.
Well, after being a guest editor at Mademoiselle, I was the only one of the 20 in my group that were winners that year that stayed on and was asked to stay on for a real job. And I did that for 6 plus years. And then when I left, I took this position at, actually at first I took one on 7th Avenue in a wholesale showroom, which I didn't like doing. I didn't like being on that side of the fence selling stuff. And then I got this position with Gimbel's East, which was their uptown East Side store at the time.
And it was fine. That
store was a great store. It was a really specialty store. It was not anything like the Gimbel's downtown on 33rd and Broadway, which was fun. Massive.
Right.
So this was also in the highest rent district in New York. And so the store catered to the Upper East Side customer. So I had a ball. I remember my office there was all red with great wicker furniture. It was so cool, that office. And I did all the windows and displays and the fashion departments and shopped in the market. We had our own buyers for that store. For many of the key departments. The rest was done corporate from the downtown office. And we did special events and, fashion shows, all sorts of things in the store. It was a terrific time.
That was the broadest learning experience, as best I can tell, that you had up until that point, in terms of diversification.
It was a wonderful experience because I got to touch a lot of different creative things. And I remember hiring a lot of people to do ads and drawings and other things for me, everybody from George Stavrinos, who's an artist who was brilliant, who passed away, to Larry Laszlo, who's done home furnishings lines and collections. But one of the other bigger experiences really was when I was at Mademoiselle, because I had become a merchandising editor. And so we did all the in-store events around the country. So I traveled to probably every state in the country to their major department store. And that was a time when they all had interesting regional names, from Marshall Field to Higbee's to Meyer and Grace and, all sorts of names I can't even remember now. Now they're all Macy's.
Yeah.
So it was an interesting time to see each of these stores and see the people and meet all these people around the country.
And then you started your public relations firm. What was the catalyst for the move from at Gimbel's to running your own firm? Just a natural progression or autonomy?
Yeah, it's just things just evolve somehow naturally. I mean, I never have a 5-year plan. I never think about what's really going to be next. And I'm not even sure if it was after Gimbel's. I think there was something else in between that I can't remember right now. But it seemed like everybody was always asking me where to get things done, where to get balloons, where to rent a space for a party, how to get this program printed, whatever it was. And I remember saying to people, do I have 411 tattooed on my head? Why can't they find this out themselves? And so friends of mine were architects and interior designers. And my friends was Scott Bromley and Robin Jacobson had a business together. And at the time, in fact, they were designing Studio 54 in New York. And I took a desk in their office and shared that space with them and started a public relations firm. I didn't know what else to call it. It was Fern Mallis Public Relations. I had one assistant very early on, and then my next assistant was a gal named Jane Hertzmark who shared my typewriter return with me. That was her side of the desk. We'd have pea soup every day over our typewriters. And Jane Hertzmark Hudis, and she's now one of the 2 global group presidents at Estee Lauder, overseeing half a dozen of their brands, from the Lauder family brand to La Mer and everything else, with a huge job in the industry. So we worked together, and we started representing originally fashion clients, some fashion friends that I had, and then it shifted into architecture, interior design, and all of that, because my friends were in that business, my sister was in that business. So I started representing all the furniture companies and textile companies and doing all their events and markets in the big design centers in Chicago and in Los Angeles. And then they were building one in New York. So I became the PR firm for that. Excuse me. And that led to my eventually closing my PR firm to work for the International Design Center in New York, the IDCNY.
And I always, when I was reading about your biography, I wondered if that was your sister's influence, just because she seems such a strong part of your life.
My sister had a lot of influence on that. I mean, I loved all the architecture and design. She was in interior design at the time and she was the head of design for IMP and Partners and Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. She'd worked in all the big firms and then had her own business. And then at a certain point decided she wanted to be an architect and closed it all off and went back to school, went to Harvard and got her degree at the GSD, and then went off to India actually on a Fulbright for a year.
Wow.
And so she was the first India person in the family, which I've subsequently become.
I want to talk about that in just a minute. So 1991, CFDA. Your birthday, what was your birthday? Your March 26th birthday. How was that celebrated?
Well, it was a fascinating time because I was freelancing at this point in a PR firm in New York, and I knew that the CFDA was looking for a new director. They had just done in November, prior to my March birthday, had launched a huge AIDS benefit called 7th on Sale. And it was one of those landmark events that raised about $5 million in a weekend at a time when we desperately needed to keep raising money for all of our pals in New York. And I went to that benefit. It was put together by CFDA and Vogue, and it was just a magical experience. Lo and behold, several months later, when that was all over and they were trying to distribute monies and figure out what to do with everything, they were looking for a new director. The president was Caroline Rome, and she resigned. She didn't want to stay on any longer, and the executive director, who was somebody I knew from the furniture industry of all places, he had a contract that wasn't renewed, but it was a very unknown organization at the time. It was very insider, very tight and exclusive. And I, being an inveterate reader of Women's Wear Daily, since high school, when my father used to bring it home and I'd read it all the time, I saw that they were interviewing, seemed like hundreds of people and hundreds of resumes. They were looking for how they were going to take this organization to the next place. And I threw my hat in the ring at the very last second I didn't realize it was the last second, but they had actually closed ranks and had 4 or 5 finalists that they were interviewing that next week, bringing them to another group of CFDA designers to meet. And when I threw my resume in the ring, they called me and said, "How quickly can you get over here?" And they were impressed, and they said, "Can you come back in like 3 more days? You know, you'd be our 6th finalist." And I was like, okay. I mean, it all happened very fast once I decided maybe this would be interesting to do. And I had no idea if I really wanted to do it. All my friends were like, "Are you crazy? That's a perfect job for you." And so I did. And the board meeting, the final board meeting, I basically was told I had the job. I mean, the last meeting was with Calvin Klein and Bill Blass and Carolyn Rome and Stan Herman, my friend, and Monica Tilley. And, you know, they interviewed me and said, "Why should we hire you? You haven't been in fashion in 10 years. You haven't worked in this industry." And I said, "But I never stopped wearing clothes." I said, "I never stopped shopping. I never stopped looking at magazines." And that it was in my DNA. I grew up in the business. I didn't have to work in it to understand it and having a feeling for it. And, you know, that led to a bunch of other questions. And next thing I knew, it was like, "You need to come to this big board meeting to be ratified by the board." And that turned out to be on my birthday. And it was a very long, big conference table with every designer you've ever heard of in your life there, from Ralph Lauren to Donna Karan and Calvin and Bill Blask and Oscar de la Renta and Mary McFadden and Joseph Abboud and you know, Monica Tilley and Marianne Restivo and Eleanor Lambert, who had started the organization. Lots of people. And they drilled me, and it was not an easy back and forth, but I stood my ground on things that I really believed in, you know, and I was asked to then go out of the room while they talked, you know, deliberated, and I sat with Carolyn's assistant in an office, and next thing I knew, I was invited back in, and the entire safety board sang happy birthday to me.
And there you had, it was ratified.
And I was like, welcome aboard.
So I've always been curious, and I've tried to really research, and I can't. What were the mechanics of designing, devising 7th on 6th? How did that really come about? How did that was that a group? Was that an idea that you had? Was it a collaborative thing? Was it a direct? How did that actually come about?
Well, you know, organizing the industry and having a centralized fashion week was very much an industry dream. I mean, it's something that had been talked about a lot.
But no one had done it.
But it hadn't happened. And at that time, if there were 50 fashion shows, there were 50 different locations.
Right.
And nobody really talked about logistics or
coordinating, right?
Being near each other or close to each other or help, you know, doing something, sharing a space or anything. And it was Market Week or Fashion Week, whatever they wanted to call it, right when I was hired. Like, I was hired the end of March, and that, I think, was the first week in April is when the shows used to be in New York. They were later, everything shifted years later. And I hadn't started the job yet, but was following what was going on. And Michael Kors had a show in an empty loft space down in Chelsea, with lots of raw concrete. And when they turned the bass music on, things just shook, and the ceiling shook. And lots of plaster came down from the ceiling.
My gosh.
And it landed on the shoulders of all the one-name supermodels. Linda, Naomi, Cindy, you know, and they just kept walking, brushed off their shoulders. But chunks of plaster landed in the laps of Susie Menkes from the International Herald Tribune and Kerry Donovan, who was a New York Times fashion critic. And they wrote the next day headlines that pretty much literally said, "We live for fashion, we don't want to die for it." And I said, I think my job description just changed. And so it became a mission to organize, centralize, modernize the shows. And that is what took another basically 2 years to happen. After 1 year, we took some temporary space in a hotel on 44th Street. That was called the Maclo, now it's the Millennium. And we were able to at least prove that more than 2 designers would show in the same place. You know, if they shared costs and it became feasible, economically feasible, and we could have a real designated press lounge for the press and a buyer's lounge for buyers, and, you know, take care of the people who are coming to see the collections. And so that became the impetus for really moving that to a much bigger concept. And we made a deal with Stan Herman, at that time was president of the CFDA while I was the executive director. Made a deal with Bryant Park and with the Restoration Corp to take space in the park, which was under renovation.
And that was that was always an important concept to you, doing it in the park.
Well, that park was like the backyard to the garment district. It was close by.
So it was a proximity thing, okay.
It was what we called a comfort zone. It was very close, and it was the only space. I mean, space is a premium in New York. And at that time, the restaurant in Bryant Park wasn't there, so we used that space as one big tent called Gertrude. And it was called Gertrude because there was a statue of Gertrude Stein that sat backstage prominently. And all the designers would decorate her with beads and necklaces and things. And then there was Josephine, which was the tent that incorporated half of the fountain that was on 6th Avenue. And then we did another space inside called Celeste, which was in the library, and Celeste Bartos Forum.
And who named those? They all came...
I basically named them because it was like, what are we going to call these venues? And so we called them our three muses, Celeste, Josephine, and Gertrude.
Then in 2001, IMG...
And we raised all the money.
You raised... Well, I was going to talk to you about that.
Part of it.
The whole sponsorship thing, the whole underwriting. Is that where you ended up spending the line, after you created the concept, was that where you spent the lion's share of your time?
We couldn't build it without paying for it. I mean, and the designers were not going to foot the big bill for that. So we were one of the first fashion weeks in the world that really got corporate sponsors involved. And I blindly called everybody, but started with through friends who were helping me and publishers. And we started with Evian was the first one who came on board. They were looking to brand their water in a new way in America. And this is when there was Evian or Perrier in the shelves, not 15 different waters. And then I called Vogue and spoke to Anna Wintour and asked her about it and told her what we were doing. And she said, how much money do you need? And I said, I don't know, maybe $500,000. And she said, well, let me get back to you. I'll speak to Cy, which was Cy Newhouse, her boss. And she did call back almost right away and said, we'll give you $100,000. I said, thank you, take it. And I called the president of Hearst, and I said, Vogue's giving us $100,000. He said, okay, we will. I called the president of Hachette Philippaki for Elle, and he said, I guess told we'll him do that it. Those two were doing it, and he said, okay, we'll do it. And then Hearst called back and said, could we give you another 100 for Town and Country? I said, yes, you can. And then I called a friend at Clairol and did the same thing. And at that point, Jane, who had been my assistant when my PR firm, had started her job at Lauder. When she left me, she went to grad school, to business school at Columbia, and then went to work for Estee Lauder. And she was working her way up pretty quickly there.
And she's done quite well, yeah.
And she was at Prescriptives at the time as the manager of that brand. And so she gave me $100,000, and Prescriptives became the brand that we used for cosmetics. And and one thing led to another. I called General Motors and asked to speak to the president, and they put you through, if you're just dumb enough and you just ask. And that was followed up with the Hachette president calling and following up with that because they published all the car and driver magazines. He said, I'll close that deal for you. And he did. And so we had General Motors at the beginning.
Oh my gosh.
And then we had enough funding to build these tents. And the lobbies were just corridors you walk through with just a metro rack of furniture with a sampling of these products or a sign with the company's logo on it. It's evolved into a whole other thing now.
Yeah. So then IMG came into the picture. Did that explain how that shifted and they purchased the concept? How did that shift the vision, so to speak?
Well, when IMG came in, it was 10 years later.
Right.
I was still head
2001.
I was still the director of the CFDA and director of the foundation and of 7th on 6th. And we were doing all the awards galas. We were doing, Fashion Targets Breast Cancer. We were doing a million things, scholarship funds and Fashion Week twice a year. And then Men's Week, which we had started then. And so we had our hands full in a small office. And we were kind of constantly robbing Peter to pay Paul to keep all the balls in place and juggle everything. And IMG came around, whose business was putting on events and sponsorships. I mean, they they would do those big corporate title sponsorships for sports arenas, for everything. And we knew the IMG guys, and because they were friends, and they made a compelling case that they would be interested in buying Fashion Week, the 7th on 6th portion. And they saw that as similar to what they see as a sports event. I mean, they said, there's an event going on that's surrounded by people watching it. There's a sponsor arena around that, and Mark McCormick, who created IMG and was still there at the time and oversaw this purchase, said to the New York Times, and I'll never forget it, he said, fashion is like sport. It needs no language to be understood.
And that's like a theme of yours, I've found, that fashion really does transcend every breaking point there is in humanity.
Well, I'm not sure it does all of that, but it is a cultural phenomena. It is a fashion, and fashion weeks and events have become a core nexus for where everything happens, and where people, politicians are there, and
everyone,
actors and actresses are there, and anybody doing anything new is there, and athletes are there. It's become part of the culture.
But doesn't it also represent where you are in the culture? Like
it does in many ways. If there's a time capsule, and somebody looks at what people are wearing in a given year, 100 years from now, the fashion will tell a little bit about what was going on in time.
I'm thinking more like in a metaphorical sense, like with Givenchy in 2015, September 12th, doing something to commemorate September 11th, and doing a fashion show where you started out with Peace Be With You in Hebrew, and then through the various other, that's something that transcends every barrier.
Well, fashion can be very universal that way, and very sensitive to what's happening in the world when it works.
When it works. So this is something you wrote in your book, and I think I love this. I decided to leave IMG Fashion in 2010 after a decision was made to move the shows out of Bryant Park, which had been home to Fashion Week for 18 years. And then you went on to say my timing was impeccable. And I agree with that, but I'm curious as to what your thought process was when you wrote that.
Well, when I wrote that, I was looking back at the timetable of, these decisions in my life, and I wasn't so sure that it was an impeccable choice at the time, but I had to do what felt right in my gut. Bryant Park was my baby. It was close to 18 years. It was ending. It was the end of an era. I was involved in this transition to Lincoln Center, to Damrosch Park, but I also saw the writing on the wall, and I saw the memos going from 3 people to 30 people.
Right.
And it was, nobody could make a decision on anything, and it was becoming catastrophically expensive, which meant that the IMG team was having to sell sponsorships, up the kazoo, and the sponsor lobby became this humongous space, and it became all about sponsorships. It became about the corporate partners and less about the designers and the creative community, and I created Fashion Week to give a platform to the designers. The corporate sponsors were there to support that and help make that happen, not the other way around.
And do you think that there's been a move back to where it was in 2010?
In that sense, yes, only because in the last 2 years, Mercedes-Benz dropped out and said no more, and American Express said no more. And so there's no more title sponsor to Fashion Week. So now it's all branded NYFW. So in that sense, yes, and the venues have changed so much now because the 5 years were up at Lincoln Center, so that's over. So the IMG's one centralized venue is now basically 3 venues because they bought Made at Milk on 15th Street, and then they have 2 big venues, one uptown and one downtown. And they're very unaware of sponsors in there. So they heard the industry scream and yell and say, we hate these sponsored lobbies. This is not helpful to us. This is not furthering fashion in any way. This isn't what you have to go through in Europe, and why does America think you have to do it this way? So IMG, which is now owned by William Morris Endeavor, so it's WME IMG, pulled that all out. So in that sense, it's gone back
to making more designer focused.
But it's gone back to where we were at the beginning, because shows are all over town now.
Right.
it's completely decentralized.
You talked then, and you said it before, that people would say, or you would say, what am I, your 411 person? This is what I think of as the coffee table talk with you, where people take you to coffee and basically ask you all these questions and take them. There's a coffee table talk.
The coffee phase of my life.
There you go, the coffee phase. And 92nd Street began. Talk about that.
Well, during the coffee phase of my life, which is when I left IMG and took some time off to reflect and kind of get my bearings, it didn't last long because people would call me every day for a cup of coffee to meet and talk about a new idea, a new project, a new business startup. I mean, whatever it was. Could we have a cup of coffee? Could we have a cup of coffee? And I laughed because I said nobody invited me to lunch or dinner. They just wanted coffee. And some of these ideas were interesting, and some of them, by the time I walked out of the room, I couldn't remember what they were. And a lot of it was a waste of time. But in one meeting I did have with a good friend of mine, a photographer, Timothy Greenfield Sanders, we were actually having tea at his studio, and he said, you should meet a friend of mine, Betsy. And so she does lecture tours with people and speakers, and you have a good story to tell. And so I met Betsy, we hit it off really well, and she said, I want to introduce you to my friend from my building who heads up the programming at New York's 92nd Street Y. And of course I know the Y and love the Y. I mean, anybody who grew up and lives in New York,
yeah.
I mean, it's one of the most prestigious centers, and their programming and lecture series up there are extraordinary. I mean, every prime minister and president and author, musician, you name it, they're all there speaking, being interviewed by somebody fabulous.
And now Fern Mallis.
And so they asked me if I would be interested in interviewing fashion people, because they've had one-offs but never a dedicated series for that. And I said, I guess I could ask some intelligent questions because I care about these people and I care about how their lives work and how they started their businesses, how they became the people they became. And so we called it Fashion Icons with Fern Mallis. And I said, let me try and get a few people. And got, the first one was Norma Kamali, who's a dear friend. And then, it was Calvin Klein and Donna Karan and Tommy Hilfiger and Tom Ford and Michael Kors and, so on and so forth, Betsy Johnson.
And those are continuing, and they're still sometimes monthly, sometimes bi-monthly.
Yeah, well, the first 19 of the first 21 that I did were put into this beautiful book that Rizzoli published. And since the book came out, and since the book was in production, I had done Valentino, which was a great interview, and Victoria Beckham, which was delightful.
Wonderful people,
and Leonard Lauder, which
Talented.
is one of my favorites, and Tim Gunn, and then Iman, and Cindy Crawford, and Zach Posen, and Stan Herman. And now we're putting together, we're been busy this year, and with all the events and my travel, I haven't had scheduled any of them yet, but we have a lot of good people coming up, and probably in the late spring and in the fall.
And then a second edition?
I hope so.
Good. So I want to shift gears now. This is the second level. And lots of these questions were derived by folks that are young. So I found them interesting, and some of them are mine. How do you approach relationships with new and upcoming designers? So you don't have the history that you have had with these long-standing friends. There are new folks coming up. How do you approach that?
Well, I see them when they become, CFDA members, and you read about them and you hear about them. I go to their shows or presentations, and I meet them, and most of them, if they have any knowledge of the business, know who I am, which is very nice. They're always very pleased to meet me. And depending on who they are, they like, oh, we would love to have some input from you and some guidance on what you think. And you just have an instinctive feeling about certain people. And you feel like, I really like this kid. He's going to be great. She's really talented.
So let's talk about that, because everyone says that you have a smell, that there is something, it's a gift really, that you can meet a series of folks and you can typically figure out the one that has the exceptionalism. What is that? Is that just a visceral thing?
I think there's a lot of people in the industry who've been around a long time, and After a while you can see someone and see a collection and see a personality, and you say, they're going to make it. You just know they have a tenacity, they have a drive, they have talent. They're doing something that has a voice that's not out there. It's not repetitive. They're bringing something fresh to the table, and you want to be around them. You like their energy. I always have said, be nice. You don't want to work with people who are divas and a pain in the ass. And you meet a lot of those too, and you say, who does that kid think he is? He hasn't even gotten anywhere yet, and he's already trouble. So you just.
Were you born to do this?
Apparently.
Yeah. So I know about your father's influence and your mother's, but there had to be something. And you took some twists and turns, with the architecture and with a little bit of the what I call more linear side of it. But there had to be something that fueled you. What was it that fueled you? Was it just not wanting to stop? Was it the pursuit of something? What was it that got, because you had, in everything that I've read about you, they say passionate, workhorse, never stops, singularly focused. Where does that come from?
I'm not sure where it comes from. What I think, partially what fuels it is a mortgage. The bills to pay, the rent, the car. You want to live a certain life. You have to afford it. So and that's the God's honest truth. You work to do that. I'm not married. Nobody supported me ever.
I want to talk to you about that.
And so you just keep doing it. I have a curiosity, and I like being busy. I complain a lot when I'm way too busy, and everybody says, "Oh, stop it! You'd kill yourself if you weren't busy." So and when I do try to relax, I chill for a minute, and then I pick up something to do.
There's a series that we do called Women of Distinction. I'm fascinated with women about this idea of having to make a choice, and I've really tried to delve into, can you have this? Can you have it all? Or do the real successful ones have to make the choice early on? Do you feel like you had to make a choice?
I don't feel like I had to make a choice. And I do believe there's some people who are able to do it all. It's a lot of negotiating and logistics. It just didn't work out for me. I was, had interesting men that I dated at certain points in my life. Were they marriageable material? I look back, maybe. At the time, I had my sight lines somewhere else. So I didn't, try to make that happen and pursue that. There was an era when I probably would have met a lot of great men, and that's an era when I was having too much fun with all my gay friends. So they were a diversion. Those Studio 54 years and all of that. Having a really good time.
And your lasting relationships now, your closest.
And lasting relationships and friendships. And a lot of those people died, and a lot of them, a few of them are still around. But, I was having a good time, and I was busy enjoying my work. I wasn't seeing a lot of happily married friends. So, it wasn't an issue for me. I lived by hope springs eternal, and around the corner something will work out. And
who knows? You're
who
beautiful.
knows?
That's exactly
I still
right.
keep thinking I'm going to sit next to somebody great on an airplane, and it's usually some really dorky woman that's next to me on a plane. And I go, well, it's not this trip.
So, a student fresh out of college, how would you tell them this is, and it's not it's an elevator, you got to give me real, this is how you make a name for yourself, fill in the blank.
How do you make a name for yourself? Stay focused, be honest, be nice, stay true to your core beliefs, don't burn bridges. There's a lot of things, but I think it takes a while I don't think you can step out of college and know what you want to do and make a name for yourself. I think you have to experiment and do lots of different things, and become a sponge and take it all in. You know, it's a very different world now because, you know, with the internet and with
Social
computers
media.
and social media, I mean, people are bombarded, and I do tell students and groups when I speak to them, you got to get away from that screen. I mean, there's a world outside of that screen, even though you're seeing it in that screen. Experience it away from that. You know, you've got to travel, you've got to go to museums and go to theater and talk to people, and, you know, social media is the most antisocial thing there is in the world, I think.
What's your favorite place to go to travel-wise? You have to pick one. This is very difficult, by the way.
Well, there's two answers to that. One is my house in Southampton. I have a house in the country, which is
Your
my
reprieve.
favorite escape, and that's where I decompress and recharge my battery, and it's on a lake, and it's really beautiful, and I'm really happy there. If it's getting on a plane and going somewhere as a vacation, one of my favorite vacation places is St. Bart's, and I've been going there for a gazillion years.
Do you have a book, one book that you read that you like?
No. Can't think of one.
Movie. And then we're going to do theater.
Movie.
Your
God,
favorite
there's so
movie?
many movies. You know, honestly, it's like The Sound of Music, I have to say, is like one of my all-time favorite movies. And as
funny.
corny as it sounds.
No, our family says that. It's interesting. And then theater?
It would have to be the most recent play of Hamilton. I think that's just extraordinary.
This is a tough question. Who is your favorite designer?
That is a tough question, and I'm not sure I really can answer that. There's so many of them, and I've always been the Madeleine Albright of the fashion industry and been a diplomat about that.
Is there a new designer on the horizon that we should be aware of?
You know, I think one of the, I think there are two that I'm fond of, I think. One that's going to be very successful, that's only had both of them have only both done their second collection this season.
Wow.
One is Brandon Maxwell, who's designing for Lady Gaga and did a really beautiful show, very beautiful black and white clothing. And the other is Monse.
Yeah.
And it's two young designers, a young man, Fernando, and Laura, who used to work for Oscar de la Renta, have their own collection. And they're also one that are being watched very carefully by the industry.
Did you have a mentor?
You know, I had lots of mentors, I guess, but nobody that I really focused on. I mean, I had an uncle who was a bachelor uncle of mine who was very much a mentor, worked in the industry, my dad's younger brother. In the design world, there was a man who worked at Knoll International when I was involved in that universe, and he was somebody I counted on a lot for advice and information. You know, my sister, you know, my friend Scott Bromley's like, I mean, I don't know if they're mentors, but they're you know, they're the stability in my life that I count on.
One of the things that has been noted as most remarkable is your philanthropic, from breast cancer to the AIDS, raising money, awareness. Is there one charity or philanthropy that you're involved in today that is kind of cataclysmically engaging?
I think the one that I've done the most for has been DIFA, the Design Industries Foundation Fighting AIDS. I was on the original board of directors and really at the beginning in the creation of DIFA, and served on that board for a long time and did a lot of incredible benefits and projects for them. And whenever I'm asked to do something where money goes to a charity and is designated to someone, I generally will give it to DIFA. But you know, when I was at CFDA, we did a lot for AIDS, and it went. Some of the money went to DIFA, other went to a lot of organizations. We did several benefits, and then created, as you mentioned, Fashion Targets Breast Cancer, which we launched with Hillary Clinton when she was in the White House. So we know Hillary since then, and that was a hugely successful initiative with a Target T-shirt that Ralph Lauren's team did. We subsequently launched that campaign in Brazil, and in Brazil we raised so much money that It built a new wing of a hospital in Sao Paulo just for breast cancer women. It's still going on strongly in Brazil and still in the U.S. It subsequently was licensed to about 13 other countries. So there was Fashion Targets Breast Cancer in the UK and in Australia and in Portugal and
It's amazing.
all these places. So that I'm very proud of that. I was instrumental in the Red Dress Heart Truth campaign.
Remember that?
The first time they really did something, they came to us at Fashion Week and wanted to do something for heart disease for women with what can we do with red dresses. And I got all the designers to do a red dress, and we did them on mannequins that were in the fountain in the tent venue in Bryant Park. And after 2 seasons of dressing mannequins, we decided to put on a fashion show. And the first year we got all the IMG models and all the big models to walk and got all the designers to donate a red dress. And then it subsequently got to be a big celebrity show. And every year it's like, how do you top this one with everybody from
Right.
years ago with Elaine Stritch singing down the runway and Something Red and Liza Minnelli and you name every star, sports athlete, movie star, TV star, musician have all been in the red dress campaign. And while I was still at IMG and in the tents, Mrs. Bush, Laura Bush, was the honorary chair, and so she came many times, and I was always her escort to walk her in the tents and greet her and sit with her and take her around. And so, you know, that was another one. Then we started an ovarian cancer initiative with Katie Couric, whose
Remember that
husband
one.
had died
Right.
from colon cancer, and we got Carmen Mark-Valvo, one of our designers who had colon cancer, and came out and acknowledged that. And that's when we had Olympus as a title sponsor, and Olympus does all the equipment for colonoscopies, so they were very involved in that initiative. And, you know, and then since then, I haven't devoted myself to a specific charity, but I'm asked all the time to do things, and I'm, you know, always doing something on Charity Buzz with whether it's tickets and meet me at the Y or book signing events or books signed to people and different things like that.
That's a significant part of who and what you are.
Well, I think everybody has to give back a little bit.
Give back a lot.
If I had a lot more, I'd give back more.
You give back a lot. How long does a trend last?
A trend? I mean, I like to think trends don't last very long at all. That's why they're trends.
But then they come back into style.
Well, style lasts forever.
So what's the difference between fashion and style?
Well, fashion is clothing. Fashion is everything. But style is something, to me, that is more unique and more specific. You know, people either have style or they don't. And it's a way of understanding clothing and accessories and a way of putting things together and a way of knowing what is stylish and what is trendy. You know, stylish people to me aren't wearing trendy clothes. You know, trends are of the moment, are, you know, the people I know who I respect, and I'm not naming names anywhere, you know, don't have the it bag. You know, they're not carrying what everybody's carrying. They know how to make,
It's interesting
make it
what
work
they're
for
wearing.
themselves.
I know where you go for inspiration, the Hamptons, but what do you look for inspiration?
I don't think I look for it. I think you just, you know, you find it. It's just there, you know. Inspiration, I don't think you could really look for inspiration. I think you have to just be open to the elements and people and things around you, and somehow that just becomes an inspiration.
And when it's all said and done, what do you want to be remembered for?
Well, I know my tombstone will probably say she created Fashion Week, which is okay. You know, it was a game changer, and it's something that's opened up a lot of doors and a lot of windows for me, and it's something that I'm very proud of. But you know, I'd like to be remembered for just being a good human being.
If you could give advice to a young woman, probably, or someone interested in the fashion world, what would that be? Just one piece of advice.
It would be my be nice.
Yeah, I've heard that. That's a real solid theme of yours.
Be nice, because you're going out into a world competing with a lot of people and a lot of talent, and at the end of the day, you want to work with and support and be with people who are nice.
If you could be one age for any day, what would it be?
It would be a lot younger than I am now, but I don't know.
You would not be nearly as wise.
No, I don't know. I think 30s are a good age to be, in your 30s.
What's your next adventure?
My next adventure is a month of unbelievable travel. My next adventure is a week in Melbourne, followed by the next week in Charleston, and the next week in Mumbai, where I'll be with Donna, Karen, and Calvin Klein, interviewing them for a luxury conference in Mumbai. And then my next adventure after that is a week in Savannah and Atlanta for SCAD Style Week, where I'm honorary chair, and then conceivably a week in London doing interviews.
You need to get back to the Hamptons, Fern.
Exactly. and one of the more interesting ones in the last weekend, actually September 1st to September 8th, I'm going to be a special guest on the Queen Mary, going from Southampton to New York, and it arrives in New York on the first day of Fashion Week, and it's their first Fashion Week cruise. And I'm a special guest. We'll talk and do books, along with Colin McDowell, a journalist friend of mine in London, and Zandra Rhodes, the designer, in the London School of Fashion. And so that's a trip I'm really looking forward to.
The role of fashion in the world, because you travel so much, what is that role?
That role is to keep people dressed and civilized in society.
Fern.